At 11 at night on the 26th of September 2002, a rain squall struck a ferry on her starboard side, 19 miles off the coast of the Gambia. The wind in it was between 25 and 30 knots. On that coast, in that season, squalls like it are routine. She leaned away from it and did not come back. By about 10 past 11, the MS La Joola was upside down in the dark, carrying more than twice the people she was allowed, and nobody ashore knew. The inquiry ran the stability calculations 3 ways. In one of those cases, the ship rides out that squall. The Gambia follows its river deep inland, a slot cut through the middle of the country, and it leaves the southern region of Casamance nearly separated from the capital. The inquiry's preamble, translated from its French, records that the Senegalese state had put a maritime link in place between Dakar and Ziguinchor as part of its policy of opening up the southern region to ease the movement of passengers and goods between the two cities. The ferry was the property of that state. She was built in Germany and delivered in November 1990. 260 feet long, 41 feet in the beam, drawing about 10 feet of water. That shallow draft was deliberate because the first 3 hours of every trip were not at sea at all. They were a river passage down the Casamance from the inland port of Ziguinchor. Bureau Veritas classed her for coastal waters, which set a limit of 84 nautical miles from the coast, or as the inquiry put it, 6 hours from land. She went over at under 17 nautical miles out, a fifth of what that classification allowed. She sold tickets for passengers, for baggage, and for goods carried up in baskets and packages, and what came aboard on the last trip included around 100 packages of dried fish loaded at Carabane. She had broken down on the 31st of August, 2001, and the repair ran until the 10th of September 2002, including an engine rebuilt at the manufacturer's works in Hamburg. When she came back, she ran 1 round trip a week instead of 2, and every week's worth of people who needed to reach Dakar pressed onto a single sailing. A ship stays upright for a reason that can be written down. When a hull leans, the shape of the part underwater changes, and the upward push of the water shifts toward the low side. That shifted push works against the weight of the ship pressing down, and the two form a lever that rolls her back upright. How much lever you get depends on where the weight sits. Weight low in the hull gives a strong lever and a ship that fights her way back up, and weight high gives a weak one. That is what ballast tanks are for. They sit in the bottom of the hull and you fill them with seawater for no reason except to put weight where it does the most good. The water is free and it is alongside. The Joola had 4 central ballast tanks holding 160.8 tons between them, and a permanent tank forward holding 60 more. How much you need on a given day is not a matter of judgment, but arithmetic, done from a book. Before delivery, Bureau Veritas and the yard heeled the ship over on purpose, measured how hard she resisted, and produced a stability book of tables and worked examples. You put in your load and it gives you your answer. That book was issued on the 12th of November 1990, and the commission recorded the note printed on it. Translated from the report's French, it reads, "Provisional stability information, to be replaced by an approved document." It was never replaced. In early 1996, a generator set of about 5 tons was installed aft on the second upper deck. The inquiry found that Bureau Veritas and the Marine Administration should have required the stability calculations to be redone to account for it, and that they did not. And there is one more finding, which the Commission places at the top of its list of direct causes. The master of the Joola had never performed the stability calculation before sailing, not on the night in question, on any voyage. Her paperwork was in a similar condition, and the classification certificate had been suspended in 1994 over unpaid surveyor's fees. The freeboard certificate had expired in April 1991. The Marine Administration had not renewed her navigation permit since June 1998, though the report is not consistent on that date, giving 1999 in one chapter and 1998 in 2 others. And then the part a careful reading will not let you skip. The Commission states plainly that the certificate failures did not directly cause the sinking. Their bearing, it says, was on the consequences. Keep that restraint, because she was not lost through missing paperwork. She was lost through a sum. On the 23rd of September 2002, the Annual Visit Commission of the Marine Administration came aboard and carried out her technical inspection. Hold that date. Ticket sales for the sailing of the 26th were stopped at 5 in the afternoon on Tuesday, the 24th, because the clerk selling them had reached 550, the number of places legally authorized. Then the master arrived at Ziguinchor. The commission's finding, taken from the sworn deposition of the petty officer responsible for loading, is one line, translated from its French. The master of the ship, on his arrival at Ziguinchor, authorized the resumption of third-class ticket sales with no limiting instruction. 809 tickets went out at Ziguinchor, and another 178 downriver at Carabane, where 7 military personnel also boarded. Children under 5 traveled free and appeared on nothing. Musicians paid nothing and appeared on nothing. Every crew member was allowed to bring one person aboard free. The commission's own count of the people aboard when she left Carabane is about 1,220. The builder allowed 580. That is the number everybody reports, and it is not the number that matters. What matters is where they were. The inquiry reconstructed the overload deck by deck, and the excess was not spread evenly, it was stacked on top of her. 337 people were carried on the middle of the second upper deck, in a space laid out for 128. Down on the main deck, the lowest passenger space, the overload was mild. The ship was being loaded from the top down. In the garage sat about 30 tons of vehicles and some 47 tons of goods. None of it was lashed. She also left short of fresh water, taking 80 tons instead of the 120 she could hold, because the pressure at the supply point was too low to fill her. Fresh water tanks sit low in a ship. That is 40 tons of low weight she did not get, for a reason nobody would have thought about twice. And at Carabane, in daylight, she told them. While she lay at anchor taking on passengers through the starboard garage door, the people already aboard crowded to that side of the upper decks to watch the new arrivals climb up. The ship took on a list of 8 to 10 degrees, not from cargo. From passengers walking to one side to look at something. She got underway again at around 6:30 in the evening, upright, and crossed the bar at 5 to 7 with a course set for Dakar. She was running on both engines. That is worth saying plainly because it is the other thing most accounts get wrong. The inquiry established it twice over. She left Ziguinchor with both propulsion engines in service, and she covered about 50 nautical miles from the river mouth at 10 knots, which the report says proves both of them were turning. Nothing was wrong with the ship's machinery that night. The forecast for that stretch of sea called for heavy rain, thunderstorms, and very strong winds of 20 to 40 knots lasting 15 to 30 minutes. That forecast went to the port authority in Dakar. It was not broadcast to shipping by the Dakar coastal radio station. To have it, a ship had to know to telephone and ask for it. At 10 o'clock, the radio operator called the naval base at Dakar with a position and reported nothing wrong. The inquiry notes that this was the last anyone heard from her, and that it was not unusual, because the Joola did not normally speak to the base again until she arrived. At about 11:15, the watch picked up a tropical squall on the ship's own radar. That was the first warning anybody aboard received, and it came from their own screen, because the forecast that had named those winds hours earlier had never been sent to them. They had roughly 15 minutes, and there was nothing to be done with them. The condition that mattered had been set hours earlier, alongside at Ziguinchor and at anchor off Carabane, and no maneuver at 11 at night was going to change how much water was in her bottom tanks or how many people were standing on her top deck. At 11, the squall reached her on the starboard beam. The wind pushed on the side of her hull and superstructure and leaned her over to port, away from the pressure. On the inquiry's figures, that first push alone was worth a few degrees, and a few degrees is nothing. A ship is supposed to shrug that off. Then the second thing happened, and the second thing was the passengers. Around 1,200 people, most of them on the upper decks, many in the open spaces outside the accommodation, slid toward the low side and stayed there, packed against each other. The inquiry has a name for the force this creates. It calls it the healing couple due to crowding. It is the same effect the ship had demonstrated at anchor that afternoon, at a scale nobody had asked her to survive. The angle went to around 17 degrees. Past 20 degrees, the third thing happened. 30 tons of unsecured vehicles and 40-odd tons of unsecured freight went across the garage. At 22 degrees, the sea reached the portholes along the main deck, where the freeboard was 3 feet 4 inches. They were not the kind of opening that keeps the sea out. 4 forces, in order, each one making the next worse, and no reserve left underneath any of it to push back. She went over in minutes. There was no time to steer and no time to send a distress call. The master was on the bridge as she rolled. According to a military survivor who gave evidence as Lieutenant S, he gave one order: stop the engines. It was carried out. No distress signal reached anybody. Not the Navy, not the coastal radio station, not the port at Dakar, not the port at Banjul. The emergency beacons did not fire. Whether they were even aboard is a question the inquiry could not answer, because the telecommunications inspector legally required at the inspection had not been summoned, and the last engineer to check her radio equipment in February 2001 had recorded no beacons present. And the life rafts did not float free, because the life rafts were strapped to the ship and banded to one another, and their automatic releases did not work. Which brings us back to the 23rd of September, 3 days earlier, when the annual visit commission had been aboard. On the life rafts, the inquiry's finding runs to one sentence, translated from its French. Concerning the life rafts, the inspecting officers detected nothing abnormal when the hydrostatic release systems were not working, and that single failing was sufficient to hold the ship at the quay. The same inspection recorded her safety certificates as checked, valid, and current. The only certificate anyone could later find had expired in April 1991. It recorded that she held a navigation permit. The administration had not renewed one since June 1998, so the rafts stayed with the ship, and the only distress signal sent that night was sent by a passenger. 6 men got clear and reached a raft still fastened to the hull. The commission's account of what they did, translated from its French, runs like this. There were 6 survivors around a life raft, trying to break the securing rings. After some hours of effort, they got the raft open, and one of them recovered a distress flare from inside it, which he fired to attract the attention of the pirogue fishermen and the trawlers. The man who fired it was a civilian survivor recorded as Monsieur S.D., later interviewed in hospital at Ziguinchor. He told the commission he fired it at about 4 in the morning and organized the rescue of the 6. The fishermen came. Pirogues first, then trawlers, Senegalese and Gambian. At 6:45 in the morning, they began taking people off the upturned hull. The state was slower. Confirmation reached the naval staff somewhere between 7 and 7:15 to 8, and the accounts of the exact time differ depending on which officer you ask. At 8:30, the Air Force chief ordered 2 military aircraft up to find the ship, then canceled the order because the trawlers on scene had already given the exact position. The long-range search aircraft never flew for the same reason. At 9:10, a message went out over the coastal radio asking ships in the area to assist. At 2:45 in the afternoon, a pirogue took the last living person off her and passed him to a trawler. She went down not long after, in about 80 feet of water. The official rescue, the National Army and the Fire Service, reached the site at around 6 that evening, 19 hours after she rolled over, and by then every survivor was already ashore, carried there by fishing boats. 65 people were pulled out of that sea by fishermen and trawler crews, though the figure usually reported is 64. Of roughly 600 women aboard, 1 survived, a woman named Mariama Diouf, who was 4 months pregnant. The Commission of Technical Inquiry reported to Dakar on the 4th of November 2002, 39 days after the sinking. It could not find the ship's stability book. The divers had been told to recover bodies and take images and bring up nothing else, so the commission wrote to the German yard that built her and asked for another copy. Then it did the arithmetic that had never been done aboard. The squall was force 6 to 7. The report states that there was no storm that night. What hit the Joola put a healing moment of 56.7 ton-meters on her. In 1990, Bureau Veritas and the builder had established that she could take 180.22. The wind that rolled her over was under a third of what she had been proven able to resist. Then it turned to the tanks, translated from its French. The state of the ballast tanks at the time of the capsize remains an undetermined element. Nobody could say how much water was in her. The salvage divers had noticed that when air was blown into her bottom spaces, only the fuel tanks purged quickly, and that she floated upside down with unusual steadiness, which suggested her upper spaces were empty relative to her lower ones. Not knowing, the commission calculated every case. Full ballast tanks give a metacentric height, the basic measure of that righting lever, of about 27 inches. Translated, this case study demonstrates that if the ballast tanks had been filled, the ship would never have capsized, given that her reserve was so great that it would even have allowed her to withstand much more violent winds. Tanks not filled, about 15 inches, and the chain runs exactly as it ran. Tanks a quarter full, about 11 inches. Worse than not filling them at all. A tank with water sloshing inside it is not the same as a tank that is full. The water runs downhill as the ship leans and adds its weight to the wrong side, and it takes away more stability than the weight gives back. The inquiry ran the numbers 3 ways, and with her bottom tanks full, the Joola rides out that squall and docks in Dakar the next morning. Its summary of the cause is that she left Caravane with marginal stability from an overload of passengers and an insufficiency of ballasting. The builder answered for the tanks. Every one of them was on the center line, so a list could not be corrected by moving water across, and the only wing tanks aboard held fuel, pumped between them at 2 cubic meters an hour, far too slow to help a ship that is going over. The main deck portholes sat low enough to start drinking at 20 degrees, when the international rule for a passenger ship is to avoid exceeding 10. In December 1995, the government had handed a merchant passenger ship to the Navy to run, and the Commission puts that decision among the causes. Naval officers, whatever their experience, did not hold the certificates that commanding a passenger ship internationally requires. Insurers had refused to cover her, and the report records that this was their principal objection. The report finds repeated and characterized negligence in the Marine Administration across 7 years, and inspection procedures it calls more than lax. The maritime inspector held a legal power to forbid her to sail. He never used it once, and the commission recorded that the Minister of Equipment and Transport, who knew about all of it, had taken part in the inaugural voyage of the 10th of September 2002 alongside the Minister of the Armed Forces. The consequence is in the report's own words. It led the Navy Chief of Staff to say that he had the moral endorsement of the heads of the ship inspection services. The Minister of the Armed Forces told the Commission he had never once asked about the ship's certificates, even at that inaugural voyage, and had relied on the Navy's assurance that she was in order. His colleague at Equipment and Transport had been drawing his attention to her condition the entire time. No court has ever ruled on how those people died. Senegal closed its own case on the master, who was at the bottom of the Atlantic and could not answer it. 22 French citizens had died aboard, and that was the hook French jurisdiction hung on. In September 2008, a French judge, Jean-Wilfried Noël, issued 9 international arrest warrants against Senegalese officials, among them a former Prime Minister, Mame Madior Boye, and a former Defense Minister, Youba Sambo. Then, in October 2014, the French investigating judges dismissed the case on the ground that international provisions prevented them from prosecuting it in France. The appeal courts confirmed it, leaving the 9 definitively beyond prosecution in France or anywhere else. The number of dead is officially 1,863, and 64 people came out of that sea alive, which puts about 1,927 on board. The commission that worked out why she sank counted about 1,220. Both figures are official, and they are some 700 apart, and nobody can close that gap now, because a ferry where infants traveled unrecorded, where musicians were on no list, and where every crew member could bring a friend, never had a true count of who was on her. Accounts of the bodies recovered differ too, between roughly 550 and just over 600. Against a toll of 1,863, that means most of the dead were never recovered at all. She is still down there in about 80 feet of water off Point de Sanyang. And the thing she needed on the night she was lost was seawater. Not a bigger ship, not a calmer sea, not a rescue service that reached her before 6 the following evening. Wait, low down, in tanks built into her bottom for that one purpose. She capsized into the Atlantic. It was the same water that would have held her up, and there was never a shortage of it. Nature runs its own autopsies. Those are on Tornado Autopsy.